Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's my pleasure to speak to you today about a topic that I've been interested in for quite some time, and hopefully some of you will find it connected to some of the work you're doing and some of the things you're interested in as well. Now, I don't really have a strong title for this project yet, but it is an ongoing project. And what basically, I'll sketch out the elements that I'm interested in and the directions I think that are going to be fruitful. So essentially, the focus is concept art and illustration and how this fits into the production culture of video games, and especially for amateurs. So there's lots of sort of moving parts in that. And essentially, there's a couple of reasons for this, which I'll get into. But I really wanted to start a direction, both for an ongoing research project for myself, but also signal that I think that there's some interesting work here, which multiple people might be interested to sketch out. So, some background for me first. My name is Christian McCrea, in case you haven't read the introduction brief. My role is in student selection at RMIT University. So aside from research and teaching, I select students for the degree. It's a degree that selects via Artfolio and Creative Folio, not by high school score at all. And I've also been a past consultant at 3 other universities across Australia for games student selection problems, priorities, and strategies. So in this role, both at RMIT and elsewhere, I guess the knowledge that I have had and the experience that I've had is in seeing students acquire skills, knowledges, and expectations about game design before they get to university, and understanding what that environment looks like before they get into the professional arena. So really in the high school years, obviously, but that's not, of course, the only context in which those expectations, skills, and knowledges grow. And then personally, my tech research interest is in how textual analysis finds a way forward underneath instrumentalization. And personally, that has been quite fruitful in understanding how game worlds are texts and images and art practice within games find themselves as researchable, given new priorities and the way that such research occurs these days in the university context, which is very, very different than classical textual analysis. So really my 3 kind of connected points are that concept art and illustration and technical game art are structural elements of video game production and consumption. Hopefully I can get into that in a little bit of detail in a couple of minutes. And that structure is not only of a production image. That is to say that it is not just about making video games, but it is in and of itself an image of production. And obviously, this is about becoming an artist and becoming a designer as much as it is to developing work for the official system. Now, most importantly, from a cultural point of view, this means that expectations form. And expectations in this context form around character and environment-driven games. So there's a couple of moving parts that I think are worth examining, both in terms of conceptual thinking and later down the track, hopefully, some kind of robust material approach, asking young people what's going on. This is not at that point yet. Hopefully in the years to come, this is where future work that I or others, or perhaps me and others, if you're interested in pursuing in the future. Now, Laurie Taylor wrote in 2007 a quite interesting book chapter in the Video Games and Art book, which we have always seen floating around, has a very interesting chapter with a couple of very interesting statements in it. And that chapter is called Networking Power Video Game Structure from Concept Art. Now, although it extends the metaphor into territory that perhaps wouldn't perhaps work as well 13 years later, there's a very compelling early element of this chapter, and this passage really stood out to me and has always stood out to me. While video game designers did not seek to create an underlying superstructure through concept art, that's my T missing there, the combination of concept art with the culture of video gaming led to the popular and industry-approved belief that concept art was the real of each video game. Now, this might ring as somewhat familiar to some of you, that the concept art that we associate with video games is sometimes hyper-realistic. It is a promise for a game that is then delivered, and we understand that, I think, roughly from the consumer point of view very clearly. But there is a bigger picture here, and I think one that's worth just quickly sketching out as we move through. In design history, this is actually a very familiar concept, and it has multiple names. It's an instrumentalized image, and it's one that helps to clarify a production path. For the first 20 years of video games, it was not that luxurious. It was quite simple to graph sprites onto sheets of graph paper and to plan out the art. But very quickly, of course, the stylization of graph paper allowed for different style elements to insert themselves into video game production. There is no method of production that does not leave a mark or stain on the finished product. It is not a blank process. Of course, there is also the almost ubiquitous reference set to the concept of the paratext, or the game paratext. And of course, most importantly, we might think of Mia Consalvo's use from 2007 onwards. So concept art is, of course, not the text itself from the high point of view. However, hopefully, by this point, we have established some recognition that the ephemera, I do prefer that word in some ways, that the ephemera of video games has a life of its own, and especially for those in the context of seeing video games in a particular way. That is to say, they are not consuming video games on the regular register. They are looking for art, style, nuance of art and style, things to emulate, copy, contrive, and contribute to. So what does it look like? Well, in practice, there's a couple of things worth looking at. The pro-am, or the professional amateur social network elements, are of course the biggest one in play. And that is to say that the art-driven communities on social networks have mutated differently to others, and in some cases moved against the grain of their home platforms. And so specifically, just draw your attention to Tumblr, ArtStation, DeviantArt, and now Twitter, of course, which has its own image culture, which is quite complex. Now, what's an art-driven community? An art-driven community inside or on top of a social network is one where the production, sharing, mutual support, and mutual reference of art produced by the participant is the coin and trade of their relationship with others. There are other elements here which are perhaps too numerous to discuss, about the performance of not just the art, but the anxieties about its production, stylization questions, and the way that games, animation, webcomics, web illustration all merge very, very cleanly on one level, but orient themselves towards a high production, that is to say a finished professional product, somewhere, often squarely, in the arena of video games, which is of interest to us, I think. So game-focused concept artists, at first, we might say they exist in a kind of informal economy on these platforms. They sometimes do work for video games for money. Sometimes they do work that exists in the margins. Sometimes they do work which is in reference to finished products, if you like. But all these things, it's not that the economy is grey, it's that the terms are grey. And this is where art is interesting to research and interesting to look at online, because the environment isn't behaving the way that other environments, even on the same social network, perform. So there's lots of different nuances that are quite interesting, and hopefully I can show you a couple. For example, commissioning peer economic environment has adapted to the segmented workflows in industry. Now, what I mean by that is that artists, young artists, are often commissioning each other at a very, very young age to draw each other's characters, original characters and game characters in particular situations, given each young person or artist's style. Now, this cross-commissioning and peer economic system is like a whole other book, like it's a whole other world to discuss, but it is massive. I would balk at anyone that says this is a small phenomenon. This is absolutely massive, and the work, obviously, there are many scholars sort of pointing in this direction, looking at these social networks, but the art element is really mutating quite fast and has elements of its own that are worth contemplating and understanding how these kind of grey economies sort of mutating quickly over time. So I briefly want to sketch this out for you. The way I think about these networks is that there's an attitudinal shift towards production, in inverted commas, that is perhaps accurate and not accurate at the same time. The first element is that some young artists will see their art as an independent type of intellectual property. That's quite depressing in some ways, but it has some really exciting dimensions as well. For the first thing I want to identify for you, and this is like a free paper for someone. If anyone wants to write a paper with me about this topic, this is huge. A massive normalization of the concept of OC, or original character. And this is for people who create art online for games, animation, and webcomics. This concept is absolutely tectonic. It's massive, and it creates an ongoing creative focus for an artist. And this their original character, their OC, is a persona which is swappable, fungible into consumed media at the imaginative level. That is to say, it's fandom without the referent work. It is absolutely, it's mutating very, very quickly, but I cannot emphasize enough how exciting I find this concept. When I see young artists talk about their OC, it is often a stylized imprint gained from a couple of games, animations, webcomics, but is completely divorced of that element. So this would be kind of, our closest reference point in academia is where sort of fandom studies left off, when it was talking about sort of, multiple layers of fictive communities. But this is something very, very different, and I think there's an economic element as well. Also important to note there that the social network attitudes have become intertwined with professional distance and exposure paralysis. I think it's often very easy for academics to look at the emotional content of social networks and not really know what to say or do. But in fact, over distance and over time, just with a basic content analysis, a lot of it is, definable. And I think you have a lot of artists online who speak to an anxiety that is not just about emotion, but about the policies of the networks that they're on. They are exposed financially and legally when they post their artwork online. One begets the other. The second element I want to draw your attention to is that consumption is regulated as creative. So that's the normalization of styles, genres, and even intellectual property, which is self-sustains game illustration cultures. Now, what I mean by that is that there are certain properties of certain shows, games, which are seen as more creative for people to watch before they produce artwork. Now, this also feeds into seasonal activities, participation in seasonal activities such as event jams, theme months, and charity drives, which emulate game systems but aren't in games. They're on social networks and they're externalized onto that social media. So they're reasons to draw, essentially, that are not connected in those ways. So the short version of those two for me is that you have a pressure to innovate and technically excel at a very young age, and that is visible on self-regulation of younger artists online. And second is that you have this visible patterns of fandom, but which they're actually tending towards professionalized consumption strategies as well, with legitimacy and reputation at risk. So this is a different mix of concepts, I think, than we had sort of perhaps expected sort of 10 years ago. I think that's quite exciting. So brief historical antecedents worth mentioning for those who are sort of got a longer bow and a bit of experience, which you're probably thinking, wait a minute, this sounds like something I'm aware of. Of course, there is the birth of art direction via Yard Inen in film, set up the Tilford Cinema Corporation. And the reason this is a reference point is because the consumption strategy that young artists or inexperienced artists develop online is not just an artist, but one of the art director, learning how to make multiple things at once. The maquillage, the set dressing, the color toning. It's not just one skill set, but it's many skill sets. And it's through this lens, the art direction lens, that you can explain a great deal of how these cultures work online. It's not just about an artist looking after their image, but the knowledge set that they're gaining. This is the professional skill set at work. It's the art director's skill set. And I think this is the reference point that's worth mentioning. In terms of how the consumption works, however, I think we can perhaps go back to Arby Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas in the way that this project was really, really basic in its impact, but massive as well, had a huge influence on the emergence of mood boards, serial images, comparison images, and that has had a massive impact on the way that reproduced art has allowed artists, for 100 years to develop comparison drawing skills and then develop a stylistic tendency of their own and of course within their community as well. So this is a project that kind of, as image reproduction was getting easier, was thinking about shapes and gestures recurring throughout history and how these things can be sort of mapped backwards. This looks increasingly the way that Pinterest looks for an artist, is essentially where I'm going in a short 15-minute version, is that gestures are collected and mood boards, but gesture boards, hand boards, headboards, in order for the artist to consume in a strategic way to gain professional skills. And I think this is the reference point that's worth pointing in that direction. So briefly, my two takeaways are that concept art and illustration and technical game art are structural elements of video game production and consumption. And if you like, they not only form part of the production ecosystem of games, but we could understand that ecosystem as being bigger than production itself. That is to say, professional amateur is one pathway into that reading. Of course, there are others as well. So essentially, wanting to make games does not just mean they are pointing towards the game industry. There's many other elements at stake. The second is that the content of games is informed by the methods of professionalization taken by its participants. This is a bigger question, which I haven't had much to discuss, time to discuss, but it should be self-evident, because it's true everywhere else in the creative arts, that the methods of professionalization by people will have influenced the type of content that games are producing. So this involves the social network dynamics and the community dynamics captured inside them. Where I'm sort of going with that is that the character focus and environment focus of artists as they professionalize into the game industry has produced more character and environment driven games. Therefore, the social networks, the community dynamics, all those power relationships which we're very good at understanding are not just about form, they're also about content. Thank you and good night.